The story of Romeo and Juliet.
At the time of our story, the two chief families in Verona were the rich Capulets and the Montagues. Now there had been an old quarrel between these families, which was grown to such a height, and so deadly was the enmity between them, that it was extended to the remotest kindred, to the followers and retainers of both sides, insomuch that a servant of the house of Montague could not meet a servant of the house of Capulet, nor a Capulet encounter with a Montague by chance, but fierce words and sometimes bloodshed ensued, and frequent were the brawls from such accidental meetings, which disturbed the happy, quiet Verona streets. One night old Lord Capulet made a great supper, to which many fair ladies and many noble guests were invited. All were made welcome, if they were not of the house of Montague. At this feast of Capulets, Rosaline, beloved of Romeo, son to the old Lord Montague, was present, and though it was dangerous for a Montague to be seen in this assembly, yet Benvolio and Mercutio, friends of Romeo, persuaded the young lord to go with them to this feast, but disguised in a mask. Old Capulet bid them welcome, and light-heartedly told them that he had worn a mask when he was young, and could have told a whispering tale in a fair lady's ear. They fell to dancing, and suddenly Romeo was struck with the exceeding beauty of a young girl who danced there, and he remarked how richly her perfections shone above all her other lady companions. While he uttered these praises, he was overheard by Tybalt, a nephew of Lord Capulet, who knew him by his voice to be Romeo. And this Tybalt, being of a fiery and passionate temper, could not endure that a Montague should come under cover of a mask to their solemnities, and he stormed and raged exceedingly, and would have struck young Romeo dead. But his uncle, the old Lord Capulet, would not suffer him to do any injury, both out of respect to his guests, and because Romeo had borne himself like a gentleman. And all tongues in Verona bragged of him to be a virtuous and well-governed youth. Tybalt, forced to be patient against his will, restrained himself, but swore that this vile Montague should at another time dearly pay for his intrusion. The dancing being done, Romeo watched the place where the young girl stood, and being still disguised with his mask, presumed in the gentlest manner to take her by the hand, calling it a shrine, which, if he profaned by touching it, he was a blushing pilgrim, and would kiss it for atonement. She replied,
Good pilgrim, your devotion is far too mannerly and too courtly. Saints have hands which pilgrims may touch, but kiss not.
Have not saints lips, and pilgrims too?
Aye, lips which they must use in prayer.
Oh, then, my dear saint, hear my prayer, and grant it, lest I despair.
In such loving conceits were they engaged, until the young girl was called away to her mother. Romeo, on inquiring who her mother was, discovered that the girl whose peerless beauty had so struck him was young Juliet, daughter and heir to the Lord Capulet, the great enemy of the Montagues, and that he had unknowingly engaged his heart to his foe. This troubled him, but it could not dissuade him from loving her. As little rest had Juliet when she found that the gentleman that she had been talking with was Romeo and a Montague, for she had been suddenly smit with the same hasty passion for Romeo which he had conceived for her. It now seemed that she must love her enemy, and that her affections would settle where her family consideration should induce her chiefly to hate.
At midnight, Romeo with his companions departed, but unable to stay away from the place where he had left his heart, Romeo leapt the wall of an orchard which was at the back of Juliet's house. Here he had not been long ruminating on his new love when Juliet appeared, above at a window, through which her exceeding beauty seemed to him to break like the light of the sun in the east. Juliet, thinking herself alone, fetched a deep sigh, and exclaimed,
Ah, me!
Romeo, enraptured to hear her speak, said softly and unheard by her, Oh, speak again, bright angel, for such you appear, being over my head like a winged messenger from heaven whom mortals fall back to gaze upon. She, unconscious of being overheard, and full of the new passion which that night's adventure had given birth to, called upon her lover by name.
"Oh, Romeo! Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father, and refuse thy name for my sake, or if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I no longer will be a Capulet."
Romeo, having this encouragement, would have spoken, but the girl continued her passionate discourse with herself, still chiding Romeo for being Romeo and a Montague, and wishing him some other name and family. Romeo could no longer refrain, but taking up the dialogue as if her words had been addressed to him personally, he bade her call him Love, or by whatever other name she pleased, for he was no longer Romeo, if that name was displeasing to her.
Juliet, startled to hear a man's voice in the garden, did not at first know who it was, but when he spoke again she knew immediately that it was young Romeo, and she became alarmed, for if any of her kinsmen should find him there, it would be death to him, being a Montague. But Romeo replied,
"Alack, there is more peril in your eye than in 20 of their swords. Do you but look kind upon me, and I am proof against their enmity. Better my life should be ended by their hate, than that hated life should be prolonged to live without your love."
"How came you into this place? And by whose direction?"
"Love directed me. I am no pilot, yet wert thou as far apart from me as that vast shore which is washed with the farthest sea, I should still venture for such merchandise."
A blush came over Juliet's face, but there was no room in her case for denials. Romeo had heard from her own tongue a confession of her love. So with an honest frankness she confirmed the truth of what he had heard before, and addressing him by the name of Fair Montague, told him her bounty was as infinite as the sea, and her love as deep. From this loving conference she was called away by her nurse, for it was near to daybreak, but hastily returning, she said 3 or 4 words more to Romeo, the purport of which was that if his love was indeed honourable, and his purpose marriage, she would send a messenger to him tomorrow to appoint a time for their marriage, when she would lay all her fortunes at his feet and follow him as her lord throughout the world.
The day was breaking when they parted, and Romeo, who was too full of thoughts of Juliet to allow him to sleep, instead of going home, bent his course to a monastery hard by, to find Friar Lawrence. The good friar was already up at his devotions, but seeing young Romeo abroad so early, he conjectured rightly that Romeo's wakefulness was due to an affair of the heart. Romeo revealed his new passion for Juliet, and requested the assistance of the friar to marry them that day. The holy man lifted up his eyes in wonder at the sudden change in Romeo's affections, but such was the force of the young man's passion that the friar assented, thinking that a matrimonial alliance between young Juliet and Romeo might happily be the means of making up the long breach between the Capulets and the Montagues.
Juliet, who knew of this intent from a messenger which she had dispatched according to promise, did not fail to be early at the cell of Friar Lawrence, where their hands were joined in holy marriage, the good friar praying the heavens to smile upon that act, and in the union of this young Montague and young Capulet to bury for ever the old strife and long dissensions of their families. The ceremony being over, Juliet hastened home, impatient for evening, at which time Romeo promised to come and meet her in the orchard, where they had met the night before.
That same day, about noon, Romeo's friends Benvolio and Mercutio, walking through the streets of Verona, were met by a party of the Capulets, with the impetuous Tybalt at their head. This was the same angry Tybalt who would have fought with Romeo at old Lord Capulet's feast. On seeing Mercutio, he accused him bluntly of associating with Romeo, a Montague. Mercutio, who had as much fire and youthful blood in him as Tybalt, replied to this accusation with some sharpness, and in spite of all Benvolio could say to moderate their wrath, their quarrelling increased. At this moment Romeo himself passed their way, and immediately the fierce Tybalt turned from Mercutio to Romeo, calling him a villain. Romeo had no wish for a quarrel with Tybalt, because he was the kinsman of Juliet, and much beloved by her. Besides, this young Montague had never wanted to enter into the family quarrel, being by nature wise and gentle. So he tried to reason with Tybalt, whom he saluted by the name of Good Capulet. But Tybalt, who hated all Montagues as he hated hell, would hear no reason, but drew his weapon. And Mercutio, who knew not of Romeo's secret motive for desiring peace with Tybalt, looked upon his present forbearance as dishonourable submission, and challenged Tybalt to a fight, which they did, until Mercutio fell, receiving his death's wound, while Romeo and Benvolio were vainly endeavouring to part the combatants. Mercutio being dead, Romeo could hold back his temper no longer, and fought with Tybalt until he also lay slain.
This deadly broil, falling out in the midst of Verona at noonday, quickly brought a crowd of citizens to the spot, among them the old lords Capulet and Montague and their wives. Soon after arrived the prince himself, who, being related to Mercutio, whom Tybalt had slain, and having had the peace of his government often disturbed by these brawls of Montagues and Capulets, came determined to put the law into strictest force against those who should be found to be offenders. Benvolio, who had been eyewitness to the fray, was commanded by the prince to relate the origin of it, which he did. Lady Capulet, whose extreme grief for the loss of her kinsman Tybalt made her keep no bounds in her revenge, exhorted the prince to do strict justice upon his murderer. On the other hand was to be seen Lady Montague, pleading for her child's life, and arguing with some justice that Romeo had done nothing worthy of punishment in taking the life of Tybalt, which was already forfeited to the law by his having slain Mercutio. The prince, unmoved by the passionate exclamations of these women, pronounced his sentence, and by that sentence Romeo was banished from Verona. Heavy news to the young Juliet, who had been but a few hours a bride, and now by this decree seemed everlastingly divorced. When the tidings reached her, she at first gave way to rage against Romeo, who had slain her dear cousin, but in the end love got the mastery, and the tears which she had shed for grief that Romeo had slain her cousin turned to drops of joy that her husband lived, whom Tybalt would have slain. Then came fresh tears, and they were altogether of grief for Romeo's banishment. That word was more terrible to her than the death of many Tybalts.
Romeo, after the fray, had taken refuge in Friar Lawrence's cell, where he was first made acquainted with the prince's sentence, and which seemed to him far more terrible than death. For to him there was no world out of the sight of Juliet. Heaven was where Juliet lived, and all beyond was purgatory, torture, hell. The friar tried to give consolation to this frantic young man, chiding him on showing unmanly weakness, and reasoning with him that although he had slain Tybalt, Tybalt would have slain him. Yet he now lived, and the law had been lenient with him, pronouncing only banishment. Juliet also was alive, had become his dear wife, and therein he was most happy. Then, when Romeo was a little calmed, he counselled him that he should go that night and secretly take his leave of Juliet, and thence proceed to Mantua, at which place he should remain till the friar could fit occasion to publish the marriage, which might be a joyful means of reconciling their families. And then he did not doubt that the prince would be moved to pardon him.
Romeo, convinced by these wise counsels, took his leave of the friar and made his way to the orchard to meet in secret with Juliet. There followed a night of joyous rapture, but the pleasures and delight which these lovers took in each other's society were sadly allayed with the prospect of parting and the fatal adventures of the past day. The unwelcome daybreak seemed to come too soon, and when Juliet heard the morning song of the lark She would have persuaded herself that it was the nightingale which sings by night, but the streaks of day in the east too certainly pointed out that it was time for these lovers to part.
Romeo took his leave of his dear wife with a heavy heart, promising to write to her from Mantua every hour of the day. This was but the beginning of the tragedy of this pair of star-crossed lovers. Romeo had not been gone many days before the old Lord Capulet proposed a match for his daughter Juliet. The husband he had chosen for her, not dreaming that she was married already, was Count Paris, a gallant and noble gentleman, no unworthy suitor to the girl, if she had never seen Romeo.
The terrified Juliet was in a sad perplexity at her father's offer. She pleaded her youth, unsuitable to marriage, the recent death of Tybalt, which had left her spirits weak, and how indecorous it would look for the family of the Capulets to be celebrating a nuptial feast when his funeral solemnities were hardly over. She pleaded every reason against the match, but the true one, namely, that she was married already. But her father was deaf to all her excuses, and in a peremptory manner ordered her to get ready, for by the following Thursday she should be married to Paris.
In this extremity, Juliet applied to the friendly friar for a desperate remedy. He directed her to go home and give her consent to marry Paris. But on the night before the wedding, she was to drink the contents of a phial which he would give her, which would make her appear in the morning cold and lifeless. Believing her dead, she would then be borne, as the manner in that country was, uncovered on a bier, to be buried in the family vault. 42 hours after swallowing the liquid, she would awake from this seeming death, as if from a dream. But before this, he would let her husband know of this plan, and Romeo should come in the night and bear her thence to Mantua.
Juliet agreed to all this, and took the phial from the friar, promising to follow his directions. Although fearful and full of misgivings, her love for Romeo and her aversion to Paris gave her the strength to swallow the potion. Thus it was that when the young Paris came early in the morning with music to awaken his bride, instead of a living Juliet, her chamber presented the dreary spectacle of a lifeless corpse. What confusion then reigned through the whole house! How piteous to hear the mournings of Lord and Lady Capulet, whose only child, as they thought, had been snatched from their sight by cruel death. Now all the things that had been ordained for a wedding festival turned to a sad funeral procession as Juliet was laid in her tomb.
Bad news, which always travels faster than good, now brought the dismal story of his Juliet's death to Romeo, before the messenger could arrive from Friar Lawrence, apprising him of their plan, and informing him that these were mock funerals, and only the shadow and representations of death. So it was that Romeo, in desperate state, set out to Verona, determined to see his lady in her tomb. He had purchased from an apothecary a poison, which he was told, if he swallowed, would quickly dispatch him. He decided that when he'd had a last sight of his dear wife in her tomb, he would swallow the poison and be buried by her side. He reached the tomb at midnight, and was proceeding to break open the monument when he was disturbed by the arrival of the young Count Paris, who had come to weep over the grave of her that should have been his bride. Romeo urged Paris to leave, but the Count refused him with scorn, and they fell to fighting. And after a fierce but short exchange, Paris fell lifeless to the floor. Romeo now took his last leave of his lady's lips, kissing them, and here he shook the burden of his crossed stars from his weary body, swallowing all the poison, whose operation was fatal, real, and quick, not like the dissembling potion which Juliet had swallowed. Looking on her matchless beauty one last time, the last breath left his body.
The friar, having learned that his letters had never reached Romeo in Mantua, had come himself to deliver the lady from her sleep. And so it was that he found Romeo and Paris both lying dead beside the tomb. Before he could conjecture how these fatal accidents had fallen out, Juliet awoke out of her trance, and seeing Romeo dead, and the empty phial in her true love's hands, she guessed that poison had been the cause of his end, and she would have swallowed the dregs if any had been left. And she kissed his still warm lips, to try if any poison yet did hang upon them. Then, hearing a nearer noise of people coming, she quickly unsheathed a dagger which she wore, and stabbing herself, died by Romeo's side.
The watch by this time had arrived at the monument. A page belonging to Count Paris had given the alarm, which had spread among the citizens, who went up and down the streets of Verona, confusedly exclaiming, "Paris! Romeo! Juliet!" till the uproar brought Lord Montague and Lord Capulet with the prince to inquire into the causes of the disturbance. The friar then unfolded what he knew of these strange and disastrous accidents, and the remainder of the events was supplied by the page, who had seen Paris and Romeo fight.
The prince then turned to the old lords Montague and Capulet, and rebuked them for their brutal and irrational enmities, and showed them what a scourge heaven had laid upon such offences. And these old rivals, no longer enemies, agreed to bury their long strife in their children's graves, and they took each other by the hand, calling each other brother. And they both vowed to raise up statues of pure gold in the likeness of their two lost children. So did these poor old lords, when it was too late, put behind them all rage and enmity, which had been so deadly in past times, for it was nothing but the fearful overthrow of their children that could remove the rooted hates and jealousies of these two noble families.